Welcome everyone to the Spoken Nerd, the podcast about database technology. I'm your host Connor McDonald, and in this episode we keep chatting to Optimizer product manager Nigel Bayliss. One of the topics about the Optimizer that always raises the anxiety levels is what's going to happen when you upgrade your database. In this episode, I get Nigel's thoughts on best practices on the Optimizer and ensuring consistent performance during the all-fraught time of upgrading your database to the next version. When people upgrade, in particular the people who are moving from 11 upwards, they're making that big jump, probably 11 to 19 or 11 to 12. Up until now, they've probably, if they got histograms, they've got a whole stack of height balance histograms.
Right.
And obviously they're going to become hybrids.
Yes.
Would your recommendation be that as a result, when they do that upgrade, they should forcibly gather stats on anything that has histograms? Because the general perception, or my perception, has been that height balance at its very best can only be as good as hybrid, but generally it's going to be worse.
Right. So, this is something actually that I spoke to Mike Dietrich about some time ago, in fact, because it is interesting if you kind of think it through, as I do, probably during a tortured night's sleep, is that this is a scenario that I've seen where you've got, say, your 11G database and you just upgrade it, overnight, bang, in place upgrade. At that point then, it's basically the same, but then over a period of time, depending on how much DML is happening, your stats become stale and they get regathered. So what you've got really is this sort of moving platform of histograms that, were height balanced and now gradually becoming hybrids. This then can extend over a period of, weeks, months, whatever, a long time. And I think sometimes that will cause at least some plans to change while that's happening. And I think that can be disturbing. Well, it is, because I think, as I discussed earlier, really, or at least implied, that DBAs don't like things changing them really without knowing why. And they certainly don't want things to get worse.
And this can be an extended period of change.
Yeah. So I think what can happen, that then we can be a victim of that. And when I say we, I mean the optimizer can be a victim of that, because basically this optimizer is unstable. Every day I'm getting different plans, what's going on, what's happening. And I think quite often it can be this gradual change of the height balance to the hybrids. So my preference, if I were doing it, and I'm not going to label this best practice or anything, but to me, it seems like a good thing to do is to attempt at least to do what you say, which is to get the stats done. And, if you're in the lucky world where you can test an upgrade, I would be testing it, gathering stats straight away and getting the clean set of refreshed stats. And who knows, there may be bugs sometimes. Well, there can be bugs that you got that have been fixed in a later version, and that in itself can change a plan. This is the horror really of being me, because we make things better and people say you've made it worse, and you think, actually no, we have actually made it better because all of these things are now working better. But unfortunately, you've been unfortunate here that this thing that we've made better has caused you an issue, and that can again always happen, unfortunately. But if I was going for 11 to 19, say, I'd want to get stats fresh straight away on the 19, if that's viable. When I talk about this in the past, I normally say, look at gathering stats fast. You can do that. There are concurrent and parallelism that you can use to gather your stats much more quickly than you might otherwise believe.
I will return to upgrade shortly, but just given that you mentioned dealing with gathering stats more quickly, let's assume we're dealing with some of these really big tables that we'll assume they're partitioned. Where do you think we should have stats? Because obviously you have them at the table level, you can have them at the partition level, you can even have them at sub-partition level. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think by default we get them at global and partition and not sub-partition.
I think the sub-partition one is if it's a hash you don't, whereas if it's a list you will. And I'm now going to say, don't quote me on that, but I'm fairly sure that's the case.
So what are your thoughts on, obviously the more levels we have the stats, I suppose it takes longer to get them, but also there's the risk of, I suppose, that it's tough to infer detail from summary, but vice versa, if you have both stats on both. What are your thoughts? Should we be gathering stats on all three levels if we have sub-partitioning, or just go with the defaults? Or I can almost predict the way this is going.
Yeah. I mean, again, use the defaults unless you have a reason not to. It's always that. And then I must admit, sometimes it's difficult for me to envisage a scenario where it's hard for me to make up a scenario where it would make sense to deviate from the default. That's part of my ivory tower problem to some degree, because I can't see what everybody's
Yeah,
doing,
of
course. So I just try and keep things simple. Keep it simple. Just do what it says. And then if you find that's not working for you, then do something different. I think it's always dangerous to try and overthink or anticipate problems when they may not actually happen. I don't know. I think that's a sort of a mistake that I've certainly made in the past, where I've overthought something and I've done all this work when really, what was the point? But of course, in autonomous database, we don't gather stats on partitions by default. We only gather them at the global level at the moment, and that may change. I don't know, it may change, but that's what it is certainly at the moment. So either approach is valid.
Okay, that's interesting. Along the same line of gathering stats, I know we have the facility to use parallel, but we also in more recent releases have this thing called concurrent stats gathering.
Yeah.
And presumably, with some preferences, you could even do parallel and concurrent stats gathering at the same time.
Yes.
Just to help explain to listeners, where do you see the use cases for each?
Yeah. So parallel is easy. And so the first step is, do I need to make stats gathering faster? That's the first thing. Do I need to make it faster? Then the next thing is, have I got spare machine resources when I do it? Because the only way to make stats gathering faster is to consume more resource, and that's CPU and storage bandwidth. You are going to consume more of that. You need resource before you start changing anything. If the machine's fully utilized, then the odds of you making stats go faster are slim. Things running smacked against 100%. And then the easy thing to do is to just use the auto parallel. So in other words, we decide what degree to run the gather for depending on the size of the object. I would then use Resource Manager and say, I want to cap this so that, I'm going to choose this as my limit, and I'll use Resource Manager to do that. That's what I would do. That's the way I would use it. And then I would just use that. Now, if that is not fast enough for whatever reason, then I would maybe look further into concurrent. But you have to be careful with concurrent. You do have to make sure that you're using Resource Manager for certain, because once you're running things in parallel concurrently, even serial jobs concurrently, you can absolutely flood the machine. You can eat it alive. And so you do need to know what you're doing when you do that. And that's, my opinion, is Resource Manager is a very good tool for doing that. In other words, use the auto degree first and foremost. If you're slightly more control freaky, set the parallel that you want, and then use resource management if you're using auto, so you know what the cap is. And then if you need to move beyond there, then you can look at concurrent. I would say I would do it in that kind of order. Concurrent's harder to control as well, because it relies on the job processes and it will just tend to take them. So unless you limit those, it can really just keep grabbing and grabbing and grabbing. So that's one of my reasons for saying use Resource Manager to sort of control that kind of scenario. But I must admit, from the tests I've done, in most cases, the degree gives you a lot. But I tell you what, the more you think about it, the more complicated it can get. If you really want to think hard about it, if you've got 5 million small objects,
parallel doesn't help you at all. Yeah. So
parallels not going to help you. So concurrent is then really the only answer. Then you got the other end of the spectrum where you've got 1 6 terabyte table. Concurrent, no, and it's not partitioned. Well, forget concurrency. You got to run it in parallel. So one of the things that I've got to say with these podcasts make me nervous, because I think every single thing I say can be contradicted with an example that proves the opposite.
I'm glad you made that point. It's an important point to make, because I have the same problem where I gave a talk for DOAG on tips and tricks. And the very first slide, I had some of these things that are undocumented. You test them yourself and you speak to support to get clarification on usage before proceeding. That was the opening slide. And of course, all people then took was screen dumps all the way through the talk and all over Twitter is, set this, set that, change that. And I'm like, these things happen. So yes, anyone listening, if you've made it through to here, I can't stress enough, these are all our thoughts, and be aware that for everything we say, there's most probably a counter example.
Yeah, I think there always is. So you do have to always be careful, take things with a pinch of salt, as I say. And sometimes I can get paralyzed by it. I want to say something affirmative and definitive, but I realize in the back of my mind, I know I'm aware where this is not always going to be the right answer, but what do you do? Otherwise, I would hardly say anything, or everything I said would nest down forever, and I'd never get anything out. So you've always got to think about, you've got to apply your skill as a developer or your skill as an engineer or a database administrator. That's what you're there for, let's face it. Your skill, aren't you? So you've always got to apply that to anything that is said, because like the gather stats example I said there, a valuable exercise I've always thought is to just look at the endpoints. You do that in maths, don't you? You kind of look at what is the extreme end of these two scenarios, and then it's like best practice, isn't it? Where we say, just use the auto stats job, and then you'll immediately say, but I'm running this job here and it depends on stats being ready immediately. And there's an immediate exception to what is otherwise best practice.
Cycling back to upgrade,
Mm-hmm.
given that you said the term best practice, and I know whenever people say best practice, they always say what's the best practice for upgrading. But we've spoken about, I think we've done SPM to death in terms of there is that opportunity if people do want to look at SPM in terms of upgrade. And I think that's well documented on your blog. In fact, of course, I haven't mentioned the blog while on this whole podcast. It's blogs.oracle.com/optimizer. That's where you find all of Nigel's fantastic content. But I wanted to circle back to upgrade for a personal reason. I was reading Mike Dietrich's blog the other day, and he was talking about applying some RUs. I think it was 1913 or 1912 or something. And he mentioned something which I have to admit, I've been out of the upgrade game for a little while, about calling a routine, I think it's DBMS Optim bundle or something.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems to set a whole stack of fixed control parameters. Can you elucidate a little bit on the fixed control parameter, and then maybe we'll morph it into its relationship to what you do when you're applying RUs?
Okay, so first of all, I will say this is not my hot topic, because the Optim bundle wasn't done by the Optimizer group. Okay, it was done as I guess, under the auspices of Mike, for example, in that they needed this ability. And I think it came from customer requirements. I don't really know the entire history of where it came from, if I'm honest. But it's something I've discussed with Mike and others about what do we do with this. So I have an opinion on it, but I'm not really convinced that it's the bottom line here. But the way I see the Optim bundle is that it does control fixed controls. And what fixed controls are is a number. Essentially, they are used as switches in the code to turn things on and off. So if you, for example, turn a fixed control off, that usually means you are switching a code path off that was potentially added to fix a bug. That's kind of the general case in which they're used, I guess. So they control the code path, basically. That's what fixed controls are.
So is the most common case someone trying to revert to a previous behavior?
Yeah. So let's say there was a patch, there's a patch for a certain problem. And let's, for the sake of argument, say that patch is actually enabled, right? It's there, it's sitting there and it's in use, but you find that it causes a regression in your query performance or something. If you then set fixed control for that patch to 0, then it turns that change off, and then you'll get the behavior before. So that's what a fixed control does. So in essence, it's fairly simple. But then the question, I guess, is what should I do with this DBMS Optim bundle patch when I upgrade an RU? Should I turn them all on? And I have discussed this, and I'm sure opinions differ. I think the way that I've always seen it is that we've provided these fixes in with the RU, and think of them as patches. They're there, but they're not on. And it's rather like you saying, I've got this problem and I need this patch. And you get it from Oracle and you apply the patch. Whereas we're kind of making that mechanism much easier by saying, well, this patch exists and you can have it just by turning this switch on. So you don't have to apply the patch. So I've always seen it like that. And so I thought, if I had that mindset, then that means that if I upgrade an RU, I don't do anything like turning them on. Them being off by default is what I want. You know what I mean? Isn't it? Until proven otherwise, and support say you need for your particular issue here, you need to turn this on, this fixed control on, and then that's like applying a fat patch to fix the problem. So in my simple world, which is not the real world, that's how I see it, and I think that to me makes sense. I don't want to speak for Mike. I'm not 100% sure what his opinion on it is on it.
I suppose now that you've said it that way, I can relate this back to, bear with me on this terrible metaphor, about when people upgrade from 11 to 12. People used to say to me, should I set the adaptive features on or off? And I always used to say, well, there's two answers, obviously. But I would say, if your system is running great now and you're happy with it, why not start with adaptive off and then you can explore it over time? If your system is running like a giant crap show, what is to lose by turning the adaptive features on? The likelihood is things will be better. Nothing's going to get worse because you're already in a bad place. I sort of see this fixed control as similar. If I've got a system where I've got, my system is running fine, then why would I go tinkering with these things?
Yeah. What motivates you to make a change?
If I know that I'm going to an RU because A, I'm getting my latest batch of security patches, but also I've got a few real pain points, this RU claims to fix them. Yeah, I suppose I like that fact. I've now got the choice that I can basically choose and selectively choose where I think I should be going. But I do take your point. I probably wouldn't just run in and say, okay, I've applied an RU, therefore it's time to bang the fixed controls on as well. Because I suppose that the risk scenario there is getting high.
I mean, I think different people have different approaches, of course. So again, I fear retribution from saying that. You just think, I can see there's a lot of different sides to this, but I do think my general approach, as again going on what I would do in the past, is let's just do things carefully. Unless you can test the system to the nth degree, which seems almost nobody can, unfortunately, then you're going to try and keep things pretty consistent. And I must admit, I do get burned by people at user groups that say, why did you change this default? And it's a funny contradiction, of course, that people want things to change and improve, but they don't like defaults changing. In a way, I don't know, part of the reason we do that is because we believe the new default is an improvement. We don't do it maliciously, but I do try my best to try and make it clear what things have changed in terms of defaults as best I can. But the truth is sometimes I fail on that, but I do try to do that as much as possible, so people at least are aware.
As we said, out to get you mode comes in 25C. It's like
yeah, this is it, and that does stir up a lot of passion. Again, I'm thinking of my user group experiences. It is something that people get really passionate about, if that's the right word. It is the right word, pretty much, yeah.
When it comes to finding out what people are really passionate about on the optimizer, the best way obviously is to reach out to the source. So I posted on Twitter asking for questions I could present to Nigel. We'll cover them in the next episode. Thanks for listening to this podcast. The music credit goes to Zanman from Pixabay Music.